Somewhere along the way, you learned to shrink. Not dramatically, not all at once, but quietly. You started second-guessing decisions you used to make easily. You started needing more proof before you moved, more certainty before you committed, more evidence before you believed the thing you already knew. And the strangest part? You became more productive, more informed, more self-aware than ever before. And still, something isn't moving. You read the right things. You understand the concepts. You can explain exactly what's holding you back, sometimes better than anyone around you. And yet here you are, in the same place. Again, that gap between knowing and actually crossing into it, that's not a motivation problem. It's not a discipline problem. It's not even a habit problem. It's a structural problem, and it lives below the level most people ever think to look. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Most people don't fail because they stop trying. They fail because the deepest part of them, the part that quietly decides what's possible, what's safe, and who they are, never got the update. Everything else changed. That part didn't. And until it does, every new system, every new habit, every new version of the plan runs on the same old foundation. This video is about that foundation, not motivation, not another framework to add to the ones you already have. This is about the layer underneath all of it, the one that determines whether anything you try actually lands and stays. By the end, you'll understand exactly why intelligent, self-aware people keep repeating the same patterns even when they desperately want to change. And you'll understand the specific internal shift that separates the people who break through from the people who stay stuck in a very productive-looking loop. No hype, no general advice, just the mechanics laid out clearly. Let's start with the central idea that everything else in this video builds on. Most people try to change their behavior first. They focus on the action, wake up earlier, focus more, stop procrastinating, be more consistent, and they fail. Not because the action is wrong, but because they're building on the wrong foundation. Here's a way to see it. Imagine trying to change the fruit on a tree by working on the branches. You can force results for a while, but the fruit is determined by the root. And in human behavior, the root is identity, the quiet, mostly unconscious story you hold about who you are. When that story changes, behavior follows almost automatically. When it stays the same, no amount of effort holds the new behavior in place for long. That single idea reframes everything that follows. Let me show you what this actually looks like in practice. There's a sequence most people have completely backwards. They believe, if I do the right things consistently enough, eventually I'll become the kind of person who does those things naturally. The sequence that actually works runs the other way. You first decide who you are becoming, and then your actions become expressions of that decision, not attempts to earn it. This isn't abstract. When you exercise because you're trying to become healthy, every single session is a negotiation. Your old identity keeps pulling. It questions whether today is really necessary. It reminds you how tired you are. It finds very reasonable exceptions. But when you exercise, because this is simply what someone like you does, the negotiation mostly disappears. You're not fighting yourself, you're expressing yourself. Now here's where most people get this wrong. They think consistency will eventually produce identity on its own. Show up long enough and the belief will follow. It doesn't work that way. Consistency without a prior internal decision produces habit, and habits are fragile under pressure. Identity is not. Think about why that is. Your brain runs a constant background process, a quiet check that asks, is this behavior consistent with who I am? When the answer is no, there's friction. When the answer is yes, there's almost none. This is why willpower is so unreliable as a long-term strategy. Willpower is what you need when behavior conflicts with identity. A clear identity makes willpower largely unnecessary. Let me make this concrete. Think about two people trying to quit smoking. One says, I'm trying to quit. The other says, I don't smoke. That's not who I am anymore. Same behavior on the surface. Completely different internal architecture. The second person rarely needs to fight the urge because the urge no longer aligns with who they've decided to be. The small wins they accumulate don't just build a habit. They build evidence for the new identity. Each one is proof they can point to when the old story tries to reassert itself. So before you move forward, ask yourself this honestly. When you try to change something about yourself, are you doing it to become someone or to prove you already are? That question has a different answer depending on where you are right now. And the answer determines almost everything about whether the change actually holds. And the next mistake most people make builds directly on top of this one, and it's almost invisible when it's happening. Most conversations about growth focus on what to add. Read more, do more, build better habits. And there's nothing wrong with that, unless you're adding to a foundation that's still leaking. Because here's what almost no one talks about. Clarity doesn't come from adding more. It emerges when you remove what was obscuring it. The highest performing version of you doesn't require more input. It requires fewer drains. And this is where most people make a quiet mistake that costs them everything they're trying to build. They stack new behaviors on top of old ones that directly contradict them. They add a morning routine while keeping the late-night habits that make the morning nearly impossible. They set goals while keeping the relationships or environments that quietly reinforce the old identity. It's like pouring clean water into a contaminated tank. The contamination wins. Not because you didn't try, but because the math doesn't work. There's a deeper layer here. Energy is finite. Every weak habit, every interaction that drains you, every commitment you keep out of guilt, these all draw from the same limited pool that your growth depends on. Most people dramatically underestimate how much the removal of a single drain can accelerate everything else. But there's something even more important than the energy math. Every time you tolerate something that contradicts the person you're becoming, you send a quiet signal to your own subconscious. It says, this is still acceptable for someone like me, and that signal quietly undermines every decision you're trying to make above it. Subtraction isn't just practical, it's a declaration. It tells the part of your mind that manages your identity, that no longer belongs here. Consider someone building financial discipline. They track their spending, they set budgets, they learn, all additive. But they never examine the one or two environments where money bleeds out through social pressure or comparison. The discipline never quite takes hold, not because the strategy is wrong, but because the drain is still open. The moment they close that drain, sometimes simply by changing one environment, the discipline they already had suddenly works. So ask yourself this: what is one thing, a habit, a relationship, a routine, that you've kept in your life not because it serves you, but because removing it feels uncomfortable? That discomfort is usually the signal, not a reason to wait. But here's what makes this harder than it sounds, and it connects directly to what we cover next. Pause here for a second, because what we've covered so far might sound like the beginning of a familiar arc. Fix your identity, remove what weakens you, build better from there. I want to be precise about what this actually is. This isn't about becoming a dramatically different person. It's about removing the static that's preventing the person you already are from operating clearly. That's a different project, and it's a much calmer one. Keep that in mind as we go deeper. Your attention is not neutral. Most people treat it as a productivity resource, something you protect so you can do more work. But that's only the surface-level cost of letting it go unguarded. The deeper cost is this: whatever you consistently direct your attention toward shapes how you think, what you believe is possible, and who you perceive yourself to be. This isn't a metaphor. It's how cognition actually works. The brain strengthens pathways that are used. It lets unused ones weaken. Your attention is literally constructing the mental architecture you operate from every day, which means unguarded attention doesn't just slow you down. It gradually reshapes your identity in directions you never consciously chose. Here's the mistake most people make. They treat distraction as a focus problem. They try to concentrate better so they can output more. But the real damage is happening at a different level entirely. When you're perpetually reactive, always responding to the next input, the next notification, the next piece of content, you lose something more important than efficiency. You lose coherence. Your thinking stops being yours. It becomes a reflection of whatever you've been consuming. Other people's frameworks, other people's anxieties, other people's definitions of what's worth wanting. And most people are in this state before their day even begins. They've already absorbed dozens of external framings before they've had a single quiet moment with their own thoughts. By the time they try to think clearly about their own life, they're already downstream of other people's narratives. Real clarity requires silence, not the absence of sound, but the absence of competing demands on your attention. And most people never create it deliberately. Think about the last time you had a genuinely clear, original thought. The kind where something suddenly clicked in a way it hadn't before. Chances are it came during a walk, a shower, a quiet morning. Some moment of low external input, not mid-scroll, not between notifications. The mind generates clarity in the spaces between input, not during it. This is why protecting silence isn't rest, it's maintenance. It's keeping the instrument sharp enough to actually think with. So here's the question worth sitting with. How much of what you currently believe about yourself, your situation, and what's possible, how much of that was formed in genuine quiet versus quietly absorbed from the constant background of other people's content? Most people, when they ask that honestly, find the answer unsettling. And what makes it more unsettling is what happens next, because most people respond to that realization by waiting. And waiting is where the next problem lives. Notice what's happening here. Every idea in this video connects to the next. Identity shapes what you subtract. What you subtract determines what gets your attention, and what gets your attention shapes what you believe is possible. Which brings us to the idea most people have completely backwards. We tend to believe that confidence and belief follow evidence, that once we have enough proof, enough wins, enough results, we'll finally feel certain enough to commit fully. But that's not how it works. In most meaningful areas of life, belief doesn't follow evidence. Belief creates it. Let me be precise, because this isn't positive thinking. When you operate from the assumption that things can work out, not naively, not ignoring real obstacles, but as a foundational orientation, your behavior changes in very specific ways. You make more attempts. You stay in difficult conversations longer. You try variations when something doesn't work the first time. You ask the question you would have talked yourself out of asking. Those behavioral differences, compounded over time, produce radically different outcomes. The person waiting for evidence rarely generates enough action to get it. The person who acts from prior belief generates evidence continuously. And here's where the waiting becomes genuinely expensive. Waiting feels safe. It isn't. It's expensive. It feels like patience. It feels like you're being careful, responsible, realistic. But what it actually does is give your old identity more time to build its case. Every week spent waiting is a week the internal narrative that says you're not ready gets slightly more reinforced. Not dramatically, just quietly. The gap widens not through failure, but through the passage of time without movement. This connects directly to how your brain processes possibility. When you believe something is achievable, your brain enters a state of active problem solving. It scans for pathways, resources, next steps. It notices what it would otherwise filter out. When you don't believe, the brain essentially stops looking. The resources may exist, the pathways may be real, but a disbelieving mind simply doesn't register them. You don't see what you're not looking for. And what you look for is shaped almost entirely by what you believe is findable. Here's what this looks like when it's real. Two people, identical circumstances, both wanting to make a significant change in their career, their creative work, their finances, whatever it is. One waits until the plan feels complete, until the fear is manageable, until they feel ready. The other starts before they feel ready. They send the emails, have the conversations, make the small moves, imperfectly, without certainty. 6 months later, the second person has real data. Some failures, some unexpected openings, a refined sense of direction that could only come from actual contact with reality. The first person is still waiting to feel ready. But now there's an additional layer. The waiting itself has quietly become evidence for the belief that it might not be possible. The gap has compounded. Action creates evidence. Evidence builds belief, but belief must come first to generate the initial action. That's the sequence. And most people are waiting for a run in the wrong direction. So ask yourself this: where in your life are you currently waiting for certainty before you move? And what has that waiting actually cost you, measured not in failure, but simply in time? Sit with that, because the answer to that question usually points directly at the last piece. This is where it gets uncomfortable. Taking ownership sounds like advice you've heard before. It isn't advice. It's a daily operational decision. And most people make it inconsistently, which is precisely why it rarely produces the results they expect. Here's what ownership actually means in practice. In every moment where something isn't going the way you want, your first question is not "why did this happen?" but "what can I do about it?" Not as a denial of circumstances, not as a pretense that external factors don't exist, but as a deliberate, repeated redirection of cognitive energy toward what you can actually influence. The difference between people who consistently move forward and people who plateau is rarely talent. It's rarely even effort. It's the consistency of this redirection. Here's the subtle mistake. People confuse awareness of circumstances with acceptance of them as explanations. Yes, circumstances are real. Yes, disadvantages exist. Yes, some situations are genuinely unfair. None of that is in dispute. The question isn't whether external factors are real. The question is whether directing your attention toward them produces better outcomes than directing it toward what you can move. The honest answer is almost always no. And here's why explanation is so seductive. There is genuine psychological comfort in understanding why something happened. When you know the reason, the anxiety of uncertainty is reduced. The brain rewards explanation with a small but real sense of relief. This is why people stay in analysis. It feels productive. It reduces discomfort. Explanation feels productive. It's not. It's just comfortable. And comfortable is where trajectories quietly stop changing. Two people receive difficult feedback on their work. The first spends the following week analyzing where the feedback came from, whether it was fair, what the other person's motivations might have been. They emerge with a sophisticated understanding of the situation, and nothing has changed. The second person spends 20 minutes deciding what to adjust. Some of the feedback was valid, some wasn't. They make that call and move. 3 months later, their work has visibly changed. The first person's understanding of why they received the feedback is now more nuanced than ever. But the feedback would still apply. Understanding a problem and owning the response to it are not the same action, and only one of them moves anything. So ask yourself honestly, in the area of your life where you feel most stuck, what percentage of your recent mental energy has gone toward understanding why it's difficult versus deciding what to do differently? Most people, when they count that honestly, find the ratio uncomfortable. And that discomfort, that specific discomfort, is the gap. The gap is the work. Now step back and look at everything we've covered. 5 ideas, each one operating at a different dimension of the same problem. Identity, subtraction, attention, belief, ownership. None of them are about tactics. None are about productivity systems or output strategies or morning routines. They're all operating at the layer beneath behavior, the layer that determines whether any tactic, any system, any strategy actually takes hold and stays. And here's the pattern that connects all 5. Every single one of these ideas requires you to act before you have the evidence that it will work. You adopt the identity before you've earned it. You subtract the drain before you know what will fill the space. You protect your attention before you can prove the silence will produce anything. You act from belief before you have the proof. You take ownership before the outcome is guaranteed. That's not coincidence. That's the structure. The people who consistently improve aren't doing more dramatic things. They're not more intense, not more motivated, not operating on some higher level of information. They're simply willing to move before the conditions feel safe, repeatedly, even when the old story is loud. And here is the one pattern that breaks this, the single most consistent point of failure. It's not laziness. It's not a lack of information. It's inconsistency at the identity level. People make strong decisions, operate well for a period, then drift, not dramatically, just gradually, back toward the old story. Not because they failed at something, but because the internal shift was never made deep enough to withstand ordinary pressure. Most people spend their lives trying to close the gap between who they are and who they want to be. The ones who actually change learn to operate inside it. 3 specific ways to think differently, not habits to add, just shifts in how you operate from here. First, before you add any new behavior, ask what it will require you to subtract. Every new commitment competes for the same finite energy. If you don't reduce the competing drain first, the new behavior will lose, not because you lack discipline, but because the math simply doesn't work. Second, stop using readiness as a threshold. The feeling of readiness is almost never a genuine signal that conditions are optimal. It's usually a signal that your old identity is uncomfortable with the decision you're about to make. Treat it as information about where the resistance is, and then move anyway. Third, audit where your mental energy actually goes in the areas where you feel most stuck. If more than roughly half of it goes toward understanding the problem rather than deciding your response, you're in an explanation loop. Acknowledge it, then redirect. Once, consciously, every time you notice it happening. None of these are dramatic. They're calibrations. But applied consistently, they change the trajectory, quietly, over time, in exactly the way that real and lasting change actually works. The people who improve consistently don't have better information than you. In most cases, they're not more talented. They're not immune to the same fears and doubts that slow everyone else down. What they have is a different relationship with the gap. They've stopped treating it as evidence that they aren't ready. They treat it as the work itself. Most people spend their entire lives trying to close the gap. The ones who change learn to operate inside it, to build from within the uncertainty rather than waiting for it to resolve. The gap is the work. If you've made it here, you already know which part of this landed. You already know which idea you've been circling around for longer than you'd like to admit. Drop it in the comments. Just the word. No explanation needed. Subscribe if you want more of this, and share it with one person who you know is capable of more but keeps finding very intelligent reasons not to move. Now, the next video. The moment you get clear on what you want, the moment the direction finally feels real and the decision feels made, that is almost always the exact moment the most dangerous form of resistance quietly begins. Not procrastination, not distraction, something subtler than both, something that looks remarkably like wisdom. Most people never see it coming, and because they don't, it works every time. That's next.